$70,000. That's what a judge decided one human life was worth. That's the price tag they put on keeping a documented violent offender away from their victim. $70,000 to prevent what every expert in that courtroom knew was coming. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the text message that should have changed everything. Soon you will be dead, and I'll be in jail, and that's fine. Read that again. Someone typed those words, hit send, and meant every single letter. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment anger. This wasn't an empty threat made during an argument. This was a promise, a timeline, a confession written in advance. The person who received that message, a mother of 4 children in Georgia, a woman who had done everything she was supposed to do. She saved the screenshots. She called the police. She filed the reports. She trusted the system to protect her. The person who sent it, someone with a history of violence so extensive that law enforcement had built an entire case file around their behavior. Someone who had already proven multiple times that they meant what they said when they made threats. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. What do you think happened next? If you guessed that the person making death threats was arrested and held without bond, you'd be wrong. If you assumed that explicit threats against someone's life would result in serious consequences, you'd be wrong. If you believed that a pattern of escalating violence would be enough to keep a dangerous person locked up, you'd be painfully, tragically wrong. Instead, a judge looked at 4 separate domestic violence cases, reviewed documented threats of murder, examined evidence of arson and assault, and decided that $70,000 was enough insurance against a human life. The police who worked this case were furious. The prosecutors who argued against bond were ignored. The victim who provided evidence was left vulnerable, and the person making death threats. They walked free with a simple promise to stay 200 yards away. 200 yards. That's less than 2 city blocks. That's the distance from your front door to the corner store. That's how much space they thought would keep a mother of 4 safe from someone who had already tried to kill her multiple times. We need to talk about what happened next. But first, we need you to understand something. This story isn't just about one family's tragedy. This is about how our justice system makes decisions that put lives at risk. This is about the gap between written laws and real protection. This is about what happens when everyone can see disaster coming, but no one has the power or the will to stop it. The mother who received those death threats had a name, a family, dreams for her children's future. The person who sent them had a history that should have terrified anyone paying attention. And the judge who made that $70,000 decision, they had all the information they needed to prevent what came next. But they didn't. The question we're going to answer together isn't just what happened, it's how this was allowed to happen. How does someone with a documented pattern of violence, someone who has literally promised to commit murder, end up free to make good on their threats? The police chief who worked this case said something that will haunt you. Should this victim still be alive? I would think so. That's not just frustration talking. That's a professional acknowledgement that the system failed in the most catastrophic way possible. We want you to investigate this with us here at Crime Vault Stories. We're going to walk through every decision, every missed opportunity, every moment when someone could have prevented this tragedy. We're going to show you exactly how explicit death threats, documented violence, and clear escalation can somehow result in a person walking free. Hit that like button if you're ready to see how deep this goes, and subscribe to Crime Vault Stories because what we're about to uncover will change how you think about justice in America. Someone promised to commit murder, and the system gave them the opportunity to keep that promise. What happened next was entirely preventable, and that's what makes it so devastating. Now we can tell you who was behind those death threats. Shakia Perkins, and the mother of 4 who received them. Cornishia Butler, a woman trying to rebuild her life in South Fulton, Georgia. But this wasn't a case of strangers or casual acquaintances. Shakia and Cornishia were married. They had built a life together, shared dreams, made promises to each other. What we're looking at isn't random violence. It's what happens when love turns into obsession, when partnership becomes possession. Cornishia had 4 children depending on her. Every morning she had to get them ready for school, make sure they had everything they needed, and send them out into the world with the confidence that their mother would be there when they came home. That's the responsibility that drove every decision she made. By 2021, Cornishia and Shakia were estranged. The marriage had ended, at least on paper. Cornetia was focused on creating stability for her children, building routines, establishing normalcy. She was doing what millions of parents do every day, putting her children's needs first and working toward a better future for her family. But Shakia wasn't ready to accept that their story was over. Here's what makes this situation so complex. They had recently reunited before everything fell apart again. This wasn't a clean break where two people went their separate ways and never looked back. This was the messy, complicated reality of a relationship that kept pulling them back together even when staying apart might have been safer. Cornetia was trying to navigate an impossible situation. On one hand, she had history with Shakia, shared memories, emotional connections, the kind of bond that doesn't just disappear because a relationship ends. On the other hand, she had 4 children who needed her to make decisions that would protect them and provide them with stability. The reunification attempt suggests that Cornetia wasn't someone who gave up easily on people she cared about. She was willing to try again to see if they could make things work. That speaks to her character. She was someone who believed in second chances, who hoped that people could change, who wanted to fight for the relationships that mattered to her. But Shakia's idea of fighting for their relationship was very different from Cornetia's. When relationships end, most people eventually accept reality and move forward. They might be sad, angry, or hurt, but they understand that forcing someone to stay with you isn't actually love, it's control. They recognize that real love means wanting the other person to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include you. Shakia never reached that understanding. Instead, she seemed to operate from a fundamentally different set of rules. In her world, Cornetia didn't get to make unilateral decisions about their relationship. Cornetia didn't get to prioritize her children's safety over Shakia's desires. Cornetia didn't get to move on and build a life that didn't center around Shakia's needs and demands. This created a dangerous dynamic where Cornetia was trying to establish boundaries and independence while Shakia was escalating her efforts to maintain control. Every step Cornetia took toward building a separate life was met with increased pressure from Shakia to pull her back in. The children were caught in the middle of this struggle. They were watching their mother try to balance keeping them safe with managing a relationship that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. They were learning lessons about love and boundaries and safety that no child should have to learn. What Cornetia couldn't have known was how far Shakia was willing to go to prevent her from moving on. She couldn't have predicted that someone who claimed to love her would eventually decide that destroying her life was preferable to losing control of it. The reunion had failed, but the separation was about to become far more dangerous than the relationship had ever been. Shakia was about to show Cornetia exactly what happens when someone refuses to let you move on with your life. And that's when the real terror began. September 2021 was when everything changed for Cornetia Butler. Up until that point, she had been dealing with the typical aftermath of a difficult relationship: arguments, tension, the complicated process of separating two lives that had been intertwined. But September was different. September was when Cornetia realized she wasn't dealing with a breakup anymore. She was dealing with something much more dangerous. The first incident happened on September 13th. We won't go into all the details yet, but we will tell you this: it involved vehicles, it was intentional, and it left no doubt about Shakia's willingness to use physical force to make her point. This wasn't property damage or verbal threats. This was an attempt to cause serious bodily harm, using a weapon that most of us drive every day without thinking about its potential for destruction. Cornetia called the police. She filed a report. She documented what happened with the kind of detail that shows someone who understood the gravity of her situation. This wasn't her first instinct. Most people in abusive situations don't immediately reach out to law enforcement. The fact that Cornetia made that call tells us she recognized that she was dealing with behavior that had crossed a line. But Shakia wasn't finished. 2 days later, on September 15th, she showed up at Cornetia's home. Not for a conversation, not to collect belongings. She came to send a message, and she sent it in a way that would terrify any parent. She made sure Cornetia understood that the place where her children lived, where they should feel safest, was not beyond Shakia's reach. The incident damaged Cornetia's home. More importantly, it shattered any remaining sense of security she might have had. When someone violates your home, they're not just attacking your property, they're attacking your peace of mind, your children's sense of safety, your ability to feel protected in the one place that should be your sanctuary. Again, Cornetia called the police. Again, she filed a report. She was building a paper trail, documenting a pattern, creating evidence that she hoped would protect her family. But she was also learning a horrible truth. Sometimes doing everything right isn't enough. 10 days later, September 25th brought an escalation that should have been impossible to ignore. What happened that day wasn't just violence, it was a calculated attack designed to destroy Cornishia's ability to function independently. We're talking about property destruction on a scale that wasn't just about sending a message anymore. This was about removing Cornishia's options, limiting her mobility, making her dependent. The fire damaged more than just Cornishia's belongings. It damaged her ability to work, to transport her children, to maintain the independence that Shakia was determined to take away from her. And it sent a clear message: if Cornishia insisted on building a life that didn't include Shakia, then Shakia would make sure she couldn't build a life at all. 3 incidents in 12 days, each one more serious than the last. Each one documented, each one reported to law enforcement. Cornishia was doing everything she could within the legal system to protect herself and her children. But here's what we want you to think about. How many red flags does it take before someone intervenes? How much documentation is enough? How clear does the pattern have to be before action is taken to prevent the next escalation? Cornishia was asking herself these same questions every day. She was watching someone systematically destroy her sense of safety while she tried to navigate a system that seemed designed to react to violence rather than prevent it. She was learning that there's a difference between having your case documented and having your life protected. The psychological impact on Cornishia during this period must have been devastating. Every day she had to wake up not knowing what Shakia might do next. Every day she had to send her children to school while wondering if they would come home to find their mother hurt or their home damaged. Every day she had to balance her hope that the system would protect her with the growing evidence that it might not be enough. Think about the relationships in your own life. What would you do if someone you once trusted started demonstrating this level of escalation? What red flags would you watch for? How would you protect yourself and your family when someone refuses to accept that the relationship is over? These are questions that too many people have to answer, and Cornishia Butler was about to learn just how high the stakes could get when someone is determined to control you at any cost. Because September 2021 was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. By October 2021, Cornishia Butler had done something that took incredible courage. She had given law enforcement a window into the mind of someone planning to kill her. The screenshots she provided to police weren't typical breakup arguments or angry rants. They were cold, calculated statements of intent that should have terrified anyone who read them. When we say Shakia had sent death threats, we're not talking about vague statements made in anger. We're talking about specific, detailed promises about what she intended to do to Cornishia. Soon you will be dead, and I'll be in jail, and that's fine. That message alone should have been enough to keep Shakia locked up indefinitely. But there was more. Another text that revealed just how much thought Shakia had put into her plans. I'm going for first degree, not second degree. Stamp that. Stop and think about what that second message means. Shakia wasn't just threatening to kill Cornishia in a moment of rage. She was specifically stating her intention to commit premeditated first-degree murder. She understood the legal distinction between different types of homicide, and she was telling Cornishia exactly which type she was planning. This wasn't someone making empty threats to intimidate or control. This was someone who had moved past threats into actual planning. Shakia had thought through the consequences. She knew she would go to jail, and she had explicitly stated that she was fine with that outcome. Law enforcement officers are trained to recognize escalation patterns, and what they saw in Cornishia's case was textbook progression toward lethal violence. The vehicular assault, the home invasion, the arson, each incident had been more serious than the last. And now they had written evidence that Shakia was planning to kill Cornishia. 4 separate domestic violence cases had been filed against Shakia, all with Cornishia as the victim. 4 times law enforcement had documented Shakia's violent behavior. 4 times the evidence had been presented to the court system for action. Police Chief Keith Meadows would later reflect on this pattern with a statement that captures the frustration of law enforcement professionals who understand how domestic violence escalates. Violent behavior is progressive. That's not just an observation, it's a warning based on decades of experience with cases like Cornishia's. The progression Chief Meadows was referring to is well documented in domestic violence research. Abusers don't typically jump straight to murder. They test boundaries, escalate gradually, and increase their level of control and violence over time. By September and October of 2021, Shakia had demonstrated every single warning sign that experts use to predict lethal outcomes in domestic violence cases. She had shown willingness to use vehicles as weapons. She had destroyed property to assert control. She had violated Cornetia's home to demonstrate that nowhere was safe, and she had explicitly threatened murder, even acknowledging the legal consequences she was willing to accept. When all of this evidence was presented to the court system in October 2021, everyone involved understood what they were dealing with. The prosecutors knew. The police knew. The evidence was overwhelming, and the pattern was clear. This is where the story takes a turn that will make you question everything you thought you knew about how our justice system protects victims of domestic violence. Despite 4 documented cases of violence, despite explicit death threats, despite a clear pattern of escalation that every expert recognized as leading toward homicide, a judge made a decision that would determine whether Cornetia Butler lived or died. The bond hearing in October 2021 wasn't just a routine legal proceeding. It was the moment when all the evidence, all the documentation, all of Cornetia's efforts to protect herself through the legal system would either save her life or fail her completely. Shakia Perkins faced serious charges: aggravated assault, criminal damage to property, terroristic threats, and arson in the first degree. These weren't minor offenses or misdemeanors. These were felony charges that reflected the serious nature of her crimes against Cornetia. The prosecution argued against bond. They understood what everyone in that courtroom should have understood. Shakia had explicitly promised to kill Cornetia, and she had already demonstrated both the willingness and ability to carry out violent threats. But the judge saw things differently, and that difference of opinion would cost Cornetia Butler her life. The decision that came out of that courtroom would haunt law enforcement officials, frustrate prosecutors, and ultimately prove that sometimes having all the evidence in the world isn't enough to prevent a tragedy that everyone saw coming. The judge granted bond, $70,000. With one condition: Shakia Perkins could not come within 200 yards of Cornetia Butler. Think about that for a moment. Someone who had explicitly promised to commit first-degree murder, someone who had demonstrated escalating violence over multiple incidents, someone who had been charged with aggravated assault, arson, and terroristic threats, was released from custody for the price of a luxury car. 200 yards. That's the distance the court system believed would keep a mother of 4 safe from someone who had already tried to kill her and had promised to finish the job. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office had opposed bond entirely. They understood what was at stake. They had argued that Shakia represented an ongoing danger to Cornetia, that releasing her would put Cornetia's life at risk, that the evidence clearly showed this was a situation where pretrial detention was not just appropriate but necessary to prevent further violence. The prosecutors weren't wrong, but they also weren't the ones making the final decision. South Fulton Police Chief Keith Meadows would later express his frustration with characteristic bluntness. The court system let us down. His officers had done their jobs. They had investigated thoroughly, documented meticulously, and built a strong case against Shakia. They had presented the court with everything needed to understand the danger Cornetia faced. But understanding the danger and acting to prevent it turned out to be 2 very different things. For 13 months, Cornetia Butler lived with the knowledge that the person who had promised to kill her was free to make good on that promise. 13 months of checking over her shoulder, of worrying about her children's safety, of hoping that a 200-yard restraining order would somehow be enough to protect her from someone who had already shown complete disregard for the law. During those 13 months, Cornetia continued to be a mother. She got her children ready for school, helped with homework, attended school events, tried to maintain some sense of normalcy in their lives. She couldn't let her fear consume her completely because her children needed her to be strong, to be present, to be the stable force in their lives. But on November 16, 2022, all of Cornetia's worst fears became reality. The details of what happened that day are as tragic as they are predictable. When someone has explicitly promised to commit murder, when they have demonstrated escalating violence, when they have shown complete disregard for legal consequences, the outcome becomes not a matter of if but when. Cornetia Butler, the mother of 4 who had done everything right, who had documented the abuse, reported the threats, worked within the system to protect herself and her children, lost her life to the person who had been promising to take it for over a year. Shakia Perkins was arrested immediately. There was no mystery about who was responsible, no complex investigation needed to identify the perpetrator. The person who had sent those death threats, who had escalated through months of documented violence, who had explicitly stated her intention to commit first-degree murder, had finally made good on her promises. The murder charges filed against Sheikha were just a formality at that point. The real tragedy wasn't that she was arrested, it was that Cornishia had to die before the system took the threats seriously enough to keep Sheikha behind bars permanently. Chief Meadows' statement after Cornishia's death captures the preventable nature of this tragedy. Should Cornishia Butler still be alive? I would think so. That's not just grief talking, that's a professional assessment from someone who had seen all the evidence, who had understood the danger, and who had watched the system fail to protect a victim, despite having every tool necessary to prevent her death. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office issued their own statement, emphasizing that they had opposed bond in Sheikha's case specifically because cases involving domestic violence often involve ongoing danger to the victim. They urged judges to carefully consider the potential danger to victims and either hold defendants in jail without bond or at a minimum impose monitoring requirements that will ensure they cannot approach their victims without law enforcement being notified. But these statements came too late for Cornishia Butler. They came after 4 children lost their mother. They came after a preventable tragedy had already unfolded exactly as the experts had predicted it would. The gap between recognizing danger and preventing it had cost a human life. The difference between documenting threats and stopping them had left 4 children without their mother. The failure to understand that some people mean exactly what they say when they promise violence had allowed Sheikha Perkins to keep a promise that should never have been allowed to be made. This is why we investigate these cases here at Crime Vault Stories. Not just to tell you what happened, but to show you how it could have been prevented. Not just to document tragedy, but to expose the systemic failures that allow predictable violence to occur. Hit that subscribe button because Cornishia Butler's story isn't unique. It's part of a pattern that continues to repeat itself across the country when we fail to take threats seriously. November 16, 2022, was the day the system's failure became fatal. But the foundation for that failure had been laid 13 months earlier in a courtroom where $70,000 was deemed sufficient to protect a human life. 4 children went to sleep on November 15, 2022, with their mother alive. They woke up on November 17 in a world where she was gone forever. Think about that reality for a moment. Cornishia Butler's children didn't just lose their mother. They lost her to violence that every adult authority figure in their lives had seen coming. They lost her to a system that had all the information it needed to protect her, but chose not to act decisively enough to save her life. These children will grow up knowing that their mother fought for her life through proper channels. They'll know she documented everything, reported every incident, trusted the system to protect her family. They'll also know that despite her doing everything right, the system failed her when it mattered most. The trauma extends far beyond the immediate loss. These children witnessed their mother's fear during those final months. They lived in a home where their mother had to constantly look over her shoulder, where they couldn't feel completely safe because the person threatening their family was free to carry out those threats. Now they're growing up with a different kind of knowledge. The understanding that sometimes even when adults know danger is coming, they don't always have the power or will to stop it. That's a lesson no child should have to learn, but it's the harsh reality that Cornishia's children must now live with. The ripple effects of Cornishia's death extend far beyond her immediate family. Her case has become a rallying point for domestic violence advocates who have been arguing for years that the justice system's approach to bond decisions in domestic violence cases needs fundamental reform. Legal experts point to Cornishia's case as a perfect example of why explicit death threats should be treated as credible evidence of future violence, not just empty words spoken in anger. When someone takes the time to text detailed plans for murder, when they specify their intention to commit first-degree rather than second-degree homicide, when they acknowledge their willingness to accept the legal consequences, those aren't threats anymore. They're confessions written in advance. The case has also highlighted the gap between law enforcement's understanding of domestic violence escalation and judicial decision-making in bond hearings. Police and prosecutors who work these cases daily recognize patterns that predict lethal outcomes, but their expertise isn't always reflected in courtroom decisions. Domestic violence organizations have used Cornishia's story to push for legislative changes that would require judges to receive specialized training in domestic violence dynamics before presiding over these cases. They argue that understanding the progressive nature of abuse isn't just helpful, it's essential for making life and death decisions about pretrial detention. Some jurisdictions have begun implementing electronic monitoring systems that would have provided real-time alerts if Shakya had violated the 200-yard restraining order. But these technologies were available in 2021, they just weren't required in Cornetia's case. The most powerful testament to Cornetia's legacy may be the conversations her death has started about prevention rather than punishment. Her case demonstrates that by the time we're prosecuting domestic violence homicides, we've already failed the victims. The goal should be stopping the violence before it becomes fatal. Training programs for judges now use Cornetia's case as an example of what happens when bond decisions don't adequately account for explicit threats and documented escalation patterns. Her story has become a teaching tool for recognizing when pretrial detention isn't just appropriate but necessary to prevent homicide. But perhaps the most important legacy is the reminder that behind every domestic violence statistic is a real person with a real family. Cornetia wasn't just a victim, she was a mother who fought to protect her children and trusted the system to help her do it. Her children deserve a world where the next mother in her situation doesn't have to make the same choice between trusting a broken system and protecting her family. They deserve a world where explicit death threats are taken seriously the first time, not after it's too late. That's why we tell these stories here at Crime Vault Stories. Subscribe and help us continue exposing the systemic failures that cost lives, because Cornetia Butler's children, and every family like theirs, deserve better than a system that only acts after tragedy strikes.